Warning, I'm going to whinge a lot and spoil things, so if you like this game you may not want to watch this video. I'd also recommend playing it before continuing if you care about spoilers, because despite everything I'm about to say, Layers of Fear is literally 2 hours long, so it's not really a waste of time. I won't be talking about Inheritance, but just to mark it off, I do think it's marginally better than the base game. Ready? Cool. Let's continue. Layers of Fear is a unique, immersive game experience in which every decision affects the narrative. As in life, it is the doors you open, the memories you take with you, and the shadows you explore that will define who you are. This may be our game, but it is your journey. Well, that's pretentious as Layers of Fear is the debut game from Bloober team, a Polish developer who popped up with this work of art-ish in 2016, about 10 months after PT was unceremoniously removed from the PlayStation Network store. It is, apparently, a horror experience that relies primarily on atmosphere and a sense of insanity where each turn of the camera may completely change the look of your surroundings. I certainly felt a sense of insanity every time I walked into a room and had to find the thing to look at or click on in order to continue and unlock the next door, that's for damn sure. I don't think I'm obfuscating how I feel about this game, but just in case it isn't clear, I do not like Layers of Fear. I think it is a bad game with a ridiculous obsession with loud noises and a preachy attempt at a meta-narrative that wouldn't be anywhere near as egregious if the game did not try to explain how life works to me in its menu. Shockingly, I'm also not fussed on the fact that Bloober are developing the Silent Hill 2 remake, which is part and parcel of why I'm making this video 7 years after the fact, though it is also somewhat down to the upcoming remake and/or sequel that's being built in Unreal 5. The goal of the game is straightforward. You are an artist with a dark history, and you are about to complete your final masterpiece. All this is required is that you find 6 ingredients to be mixed into your canvas that will undoubtedly assist in crafting the greatest painting ever conceived. It's a simple premise, and as far as introductions go, it's hardly a bad one. In fact, the premise and overall story are one of the few things I genuinely like about Layers of Fear. First things first, let's talk about the game itself, the way it looks and its mechanics. Layers of Fear requires very minimal interaction from the player beyond holding the forward key and occasionally finding numbers in the environment. The overwhelming majority of the time, your interactions with this game will revolve around entering a room, realising the door in front of you is locked, turning around and finding that the door behind you has now also locked, and then patiently waiting for the game to confirm that you can in fact proceed before you continue through the other door into another corridor. You may or may not be subject to a series of loud noises, and you may or may not locate an object wherein the incredibly drunk main character or his wife will warble at you for 30 seconds. If this does not happen, then you may instead enter a room, realise the door in front of you is locked, turn around and realise that the wall has now closed in behind you, then turn around again to discover that either the door has now unlocked or the door has disappeared. You must then patiently wait, either standing still or spinning in circles for the game to respawn the door, whereupon you will be allowed to proceed. On occasion, it is not at all apparent what causes the game to permit you to proceed. You simply twirl around like a ballerina until the scenery changes sufficiently enough for you to carry on. The only times this really changes are if you are required to find one of the aforementioned environmental codes, of which there are a grand total of like 6 in the entire game. Or you decide to walk face first into the wibbly wobbly lady who represents the artist's wife, whereupon you will be crunched to death and awaken in the next area. If you are not crunched to death, as in life, you choose instead to not walk face first into the wibbly wobbly lady who represents the artist's wife, because it's generally not a good idea to march face first into danger. And you instead proceed through a corridor or room, until you find yourself in the same room you would have woken up in if you had been crunched. So actually getting smashed to death by wibbles makes the game end quicker. I'm getting ahead of myself. I don't want to give the impression that this game is completely without merit, because I once played and hated a game called Andromalius, made a video about how much I hated it, and then the devs responded and apologised that I didn't like their game, and that made me feel very bad. But regardless, Layers of Fear isn't absent of character, that's for sure. The game genuinely does look very nice even after all this time. Exploring and unfolding the mansion can be a lot of fun, as the environments adjust and rearrange and make splendid use of those utterly ridiculous Renaissance paintings like the bearded baby or this guy with a derisive glare in his beady little eyes. There are plenty of rooms that feel unique even if you are forced to walk around them 4 times to open the door. The deconstruction of the manor can be enjoyable as you watch the walls crumble and find increasingly irate drawings of rats in the walls that may or may not exist. When the game takes the time to stay relatively quiet and let you pick apart the threads of the artist's life is when it's at its best, watching the workshop slowly but surely degrade as the painting becomes more and more absurd and disgusting. Or finding bits and pieces of articles and diaries, notes that the family wrote to one another that flesh out the background and give insight into the traumatic history of the artist's wife, and how both of them shut down and simply stopped talking to one another. All of these are done incredibly well, whenever they're not being shoved in your face. The setup of the game, and its opening act in particular, are excellent. There's a great sense of pacing and creeping uncertainty as you arrive at the entrance of your house and begin to move from room to room, exploring the broken, run-down areas and picking through the leftovers of the artist's life. You can enter most of the rooms in the house right from the off, with the exception of one door that you need to find the key to and another that can only be opened after the game's conclusion. The opening 15 minutes present a series of intriguing queries. Why are there handwritten notes all over the place? Why is this one particular room locked? Why is the kid's bedroom the most well-preserved room of them all? You can find rat poison dotted around long before you learn about the infestation. A newspaper clipping about a fire, hundreds of empty alcohol bottles littering every room and every cupboard. And at last, once you unlock the workshop, you pull the cover from the canvas and begin your magnum opus. But after the intro, Layers of Fear just abandons any sense of subtlety. The number of times I would walk into a room or a corridor and something would scream in my ear, or there would be a baby shrieking in the distance, or there would be a phrase like "going in circles" painted on a sofa whilst I walked around a square corridor 14 times. Like, yeah, I get it, I am going in circles, you're right, thanks for that astute observation, DFS. But once you've completed the first 40 to 60 minutes of the game, there's very little else that it has to offer. It's not unlike walking around the Haunted Mansion at Alton Towers before they turned it into Jewel. You walk, things pop out and yell at you, and then you keep walking until you reach the end. Now just imagine that the staff periodically lock the doors or give you a finger and ask you to make a paint out of it, and that's pretty much this game in a nutshell. Incidentally, it currently costs £60 per ticket to get into Towers. That's a bit excessive. But there are other bizarre choices as well that really detract from the overall experience, like being forced to stumble around in the dark to find a bloody drafts piece hiding in a corner, or trying to remember how the hell you find the first phone in the library, or trying to figure out how to access the third phone in the library, which incidentally does not involve throwing yourself off the edge. You need to stare intensely at this painting instead to get the next number. There's the part where you literally need to stick your head in a bath 3 times in order to get the next item to progress, or the bit where you just have to sit there and wait for the carousel ride in the kids' room to spin 30 times before you're allowed to leave. A sequence that cannot be sped up and must be completed before you can progress. It's very boring on repeat playthroughs. There's the fact that as you get further through the game, black bin bags start melting all over the place. It's probably supposed to be paint, but honestly it looks more like Nemesis's closet. Or this entire sequence where you're pinned into a small square room and have to patiently wait for a bunch of paintings to stare accusingly at you before you're allowed to leave. The entire basement sequence where things begin to float and all you can do is wobble around aimlessly until things stop floating and you are in fact allowed to leave, which then happens again in the game's penultimate sequence. It just gets incredibly tedious, and all the atmosphere in the world can't make up for the fact that it is too bloody dark to see anything half the time. I can't get scared by something if I can't see it. But really, the game is just unintentionally hilarious in places, and there is no greater evidence of this than the infamous doll hallway. Also, you can make this happen repeatedly if you just loop the corridor over and over. It's amazing. The wife's character model is too similar to the PT wife for comfort, and that one door that you open only to be greeted by a giant baby doll face is just funny. It becomes increasingly ridiculous how often you can be standing in a room waiting for a door to open and something bangs against a wall, or a window smashes, or a spooky violin string happens, but you were looking the other way and so have no idea what you were supposed to be scared by. If the scares were procedurally generated, I'd be willing to give the game more slack, but they're not, so I won't. There's also a very strange and extremely common glitch that tends to happen during the game's final draft hunt sequence, where your character will randomly begin to spin around and the only way to fix it is to pause and unpause the game. This happened to me multiple times, within a 10-minute span whilst I was recording this. Look at this. It's incredibly bizarre, and in the 7 years since release this bug has never been fixed. Anyway, let's go back to that little introductory quote. The game tells you that every decision affects the narrative, but just like with every game that tells you this, it's not true. The game's central narrative and the path that you take through it does not change at all. The only thing that changes is the ending and whether or not you walk to specific rooms or are teleported there by having your neck snapped by wobbles. The likelihood is that the overwhelming majority of players will only ever see the first ending, which is essentially going in circles. The artist completes his painting, but it distorts before his eyes and he's forced to begin again. This allows you to see inside that locked room from the very start of the game, where you discover tens of other canvases, each similarly well painted with minor differences, indicating that the artist's insanity runs too deep and he's forced to endlessly paint and paint, doomed to never create a perfect painting. Unless the player is extremely lucky, it is unlikely that you will stumble upon either of the other endings without following a guide, as they require a very specific set of actions to accomplish, one of which is to not pick up any mementos that play the artist's voice rather than his wife or daughter. And since you can't really tell which memento plays whose voice, it's unlikely that you'll get anything other than the loop ending on your first playthrough, or your second, or any subsequent playthroughs. But wench, you might be thinking, surely it's obvious. That hairbrush plays the wife's voice, so it must be things associated with being a lady, right? No, wrong, bad straw man. There's a pair of baby shoes later in the game that you would think would probably play the wife's voice, but they don't, they play the artist's voice, so that puts paid to that. Now, one thing I will concede is that Silent Hill 2 is quite bad for this as well. There are several endings that require extremely specific actions, meaning that for the most part, unless you are unimaginably lucky, it's not likely that you'll get, for example, the Rebirth or Maria ending, unless you are actively trying to get them. I would imagine that most players will either get the Leave ending or the In-Water ending, as these are the easiest to acquire on a blind playthrough. But the Maria ending can be foiled extremely easily by just walking slightly too far away from her at any of the times when you're together, which completely negates any prior efforts that you've made to get this ending. The criteria for certain endings is a bit ridiculous, so it would be rather unfair of me to criticise Layers of Fear for doing this when Silent Hill 2, a game that I desperately love, does it too. Although, with that being said, you can manually save in Silent Hill 2, so you could just reload a save and retry if you know what you've done wrong. In Layers of Fear, you just have to start all over again. It's not a terribly long game, but given how tedious and repetitive some parts of it can be, this is less than ideal. Also, this game has an ending where the artist decides that the best option is to remove himself from existence, because of course it bloody does. The concession that I will give Layers of Fear is that as a proof of concept and a foundation from which to build a strong horror-focused studio, it's not that bad. It functions, it looks nice, and it has potential squandered primarily by its complete lack of interactivity or uniqueness. The problem is, Bloober never bloody learned. Everything that Layers of Fear does well, primarily its atmosphere and the few times it is well executed and subtle in its narrative, would go on to persist throughout their future games, but so too would the worst parts. The incessant jump scares, the tedious gameplay as you walk in circles, the poor understanding and utter lack of empathy for mental health. Layers of Fear is a product of its time. 2016 was peak PT clone era, and whilst Layers does vastly separate itself from the deluge of other similar titles of the time, by virtue of not being utter toss, it had every opportunity to set up a strong foundation that the team could build on. Unfortunately, they then went on to make a sequel that had many of the same issues, a Blair Witch game that promotes the idea that removing yourself from existence is the best course of action, The Medium, a game that promotes the idea that removing yourself from existence is the best course of action, and Observer, a game that everybody else seems to think is Bloober's only good game, and I predictably think it's their worst because of just how much its huge potential is wasted. Despite everything that I've said, I will be picking up the new game when it drops. Even now, I'm unsure as to whether it's a sequel or a remake. It seems to have been billed as both. The recent trailer showing off the Unreal Engine very much appears to be a remake, but the developer community post and the Wikipedia page for previous games state that it's a sequel. So I suppose we'll find out in early June. For now, I'm going to move on to the rest of the games in preparation for either serious disappointment or pleasant surprise whenever the Silent Hill 2 remake finally releases. I'm not hopeful, but, you know, stranger things have happened. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed watching me bitch about a game lots of people like, consider subscribing, I'd really appreciate it. Let me know your thoughts on Bloober and the upcoming remake in the comments below, and as always, Do make sure that you have yourselves a lovely day.